The Wrong Way Home: Uncovering the Patterns of Cult Behavior in American Society by Arthur J. Deikman. Chapter 6: Avoiding Dissent. Although we all need dissent as a corrective, cults tend to punish it, to inhibit and stifle disagreement and criticism, to restrict access to information that would challenge group beliefs. Cults employ a variety of means to exclude dissent. Mail may be monitored or withheld, only certain literature allowed, and discordant views may be labeled as bad or satanic. In addition, members' attention is confined to a narrow field. If free time is spent studying and reciting dogma, there is less danger that subversive information will be encountered, or, if it is, that it will be thought about and its implications understood. Dogma itself may be simplified into slogans, rendering members' thinking even more primitive and further hampering critical thought. These means are enhanced by the punishment the group and the leader mete out for challenging authority. Such coercive forces create conflicts. Cult members wishes to continue riding in the backseat of the car, but at the same time, his or her self-respect is threatened by compliance with censorship and subjection to rewards and punishments. So the inhibition of dissent may be pushed out of awareness, become unconscious. Conscious and unconscious suppression and restriction of dissent is perhaps the most characteristic feature of cult life. The more severe the restriction, the more control exercised by the group and the leader. Cults further restrict dissent through decreased contact with non-members. Outsiders are likely to raise critical questions about the leader and the group's activities, thus weakening the group fantasy. In addition, as discussed earlier, outsiders are a threat because they may be sources of support, self-esteem, and comfort, offsetting the need for the group. Research suggests that the fewer social ties a cult convert had before joining, the more likely it was that he or she would remain in the organization. When Hugh and Clara Robinson finally made their escape from Life Force, their contact with outsiders was crucial. Avoidance of dissent is a prominent feature of normal society. We assume that in the United States, our free press, including radio and television, voices all the dissent we would need. There is no government censorship. The First Amendment shields the media from interference. However, although America's mainstream media pride themselves on being independent, balanced, objective, in practice those characteristics are more limited than most, including media personnel. Realize. Dissent is exercised with certain unspoken boundaries. Beyond those limits, it is avoided, downplayed, or ignored, because the mass media are the major source of many kinds of information for the public at large. Media behavior has far-reaching effects. The media can create by what it presents. Ben Bagdikin, Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of California, Berkeley, and former reporter, journalist, and Washington Post editor, comments on two key findings of his research on the mass media. What the public learns is heavily weighted by what serves the economic and political interests of the corporations that own the media. The naivete of working journalists about the influence of owners on the news they publish is more widespread than even my 30 years as a reporter and editor had led me to believe. Although our media enjoy great freedom, they are in a dependent relationship to three types of authority: the corporate world that owns them, the advertisers that provide their revenues, and the government figures upon whom they rely on for information. These dependency relationships involve both conscious and unconscious pressures that result in an inhibition of dissent not usually noticed by the public or by reporters and journalists themselves. Most of the 25,000 media outlets are owned by fewer than 30 large corporations. And three corporations, ABC, CBS, and NBC, dominate television. The boards of directors controlling the corporations are composed of people who also serve on the boards of other corporations, many of them advertisers, forming an interlocking network. This concentration of media power in the hands of a relatively few big businesses and financial institutions makes it possible for these organizations to exert behind-the-scenes control over our access to information. Deikman's work offers suggestive instances of corporate control. One case involved the Tribune Company of Chicago, publishers of the Chicago Tribune. A member of its board of directors was also a director of Sears Roebuck. At the time, the Federal Trade Commission accused Sears of dishonest sales promotion and advertising. The Chicago Tribune did not report this news at all, even though Sears' national headquarters are in Chicago, and the accusation would undoubtedly have been of interest to its readers. The San Francisco Chronicle noted a more recent example. A reference to General Electric Company, which owns NBC, was removed from a report on shoddy products that was televised Thursday by Network's Today program. The report focused on a federal investigation of inferior bolts used by U.S. industries in products such as airline jets and missile silos. It included a reference to a discovery by engineers at General Electric that one of every 3 bolts used in their jet engines is inferior. Deikman cites other instances of what appeared to be outright censorship. Books that aroused corporate displeasure being pulled before, during, or after publication. These include Counter-Revolutionary Violence by Noam Chomsky, DuPont, Behind the Nylon Curtain by Gerard Zilg, Counter-Coup, The Struggle for the Control of Iran by Kermit Roosevelt, and Corporate Murder by Mark Dowie. Curly books are published and documentaries aired which are critical of the corporate world. Newspapers and news magazines publish exposés of business or government leaders. However, the potential for control exists and may be exercised in more subtle ways than canceling a book. Certain ideas which serve advertisers and business may be cultivated and established as fact in the minds of the general public. One example is the general belief that unions have caused a drop in American productivity, whereas from 1981 to 1987, the productivity of U.S. manufacturing workers as a whole increased an average of 4%, while hourly wages increased only 0.8%. Unions undoubtedly have their own illusions, but it is the corporate view that tends to be voiced in the media, serving the majority of our citizens. Nicholas Johnson, formerly an FCC commissioner for 11 years, put the problem most directly. The First Amendment rights belong to the owners, and the owners can exercise those rights by hiring people who will hire journalists who don't rock the boat, who don't attack advertisers, who don't challenge the establishment. Oh, that is not good. The mass media also do little to inform their audiences of the power of advertisers to control the ideological content of media entertainment and, on occasion, media commentary. As the major revenue source for television, radio, and newspapers, advertisers have considerable influence over what appears. Their financial leverage is huge. In 1981, media businesses earned $33 billion from advertisers compared to $7 billion from readers and viewers. The one who pays the piper often calls the tune. The American public sees itself as at least somewhat the American public sees itself at least somewhat through the special vision of advertisers. Effects of advertiser influence were suggested by research at the Edinburgh School of Communication that showed the world portrayed by television to be quite unrealistic. Despite the fact that nearly half of the national income goes to the top fifth of the real population, the myth of the middle class as the all-American norm dominates the world of television. Blue-collar and service work occupies 67% of all Americans, but only 10% of television characters. On TV, men outnumber women at least 3-1. Older people, over 65, comprise 1/5 of their true proportion in the population. The prime American consumer is between 18 and 49 years of age, white, upwardly mobile, and middle or upper middle class. And this is the group advertisers are most interested in reaching. The effect on media audience is significant. Viewers of low socioeconomic status who watch TV 4 or more hours per day are more likely to call themselves middle class than their light viewing, less than 2 hours daily, counterparts. Overall, Edinburgh researchers found that television exerts a homogenizing effect. Viewing blurs traditional differences, blends them into a more homogeneous mainstream, and blends the mainstream towards a hard line, position on issues dealing with minorities and personal rights. Hard-nosed commercial populism, with its mix of restrictive conservatism and pork-chop liberalism, is the paradoxical and potentially volatile contribution of television to political orientations. This shaping of reality is not a matter of chance. Some years ago, at FCC hearings in 1965 to determine how much influence advertisers had on non-commercial content of television and radio, representatives of Procter & Gamble testified to a set of quite explicit rules for television programs in which they would advertise. There will be no material on any of our programs which could in any way further the concept of business as cold, ruthless, and lacking all sentiment or spiritual motivation. If a businessman is cast in the role of villain, it must be made clear that he is not typical but is as much despised by his fellow businessmen as he is by other members of society. This is not extraordinary. If I were a major advertiser on television, I know how I would like psychiatrists to be portrayed. However, obeying Procter & Gamble guidelines required a distortion of reality, especially as P&G's instructions went beyond issues of the businessman's image where it seemed fitting. The characters in Procter & Gamble's dramas should reflect recognition and acceptance of the world's situation and their thoughts and actions. Although in dealing with war, our writers should minimize the horror aspects. These instructions further specified that some basic conception of the American way of life must not be attacked by a character in a drama or documentary unless a rejoinder is completely and convincingly made someplace in the same broadcast. Finally, TV executives were instructed. If there is any question whatever about such material, it should be deleted. P&G were protecting not just the business world, but also the general status quo. That was 25 years ago, but the situation may not be different today as the media, especially newspapers, have become more and more dependent on advertiser revenues. Advertisers do not hesitate to threaten withdrawal of ads. In the case of major advertisers, such as the tobacco industry, the threat appears to be quite potent. Edith Whalen, a journalist with the American Council on Science and Health, reported in 1980 that she had approached the leading women's magazines, Cosmopolitan, Harper's Bazaar, Ladies' Home Journal, Mademoiselle, Ms., McCall's, Redbook, 17, Vogue, and Working Woman, asking them to run articles on the growing incidence of smoking-induced disease in women. All of these magazines had run articles supporting the Equal Rights Amendment, but in this case they refused. Whalen commented, "I frequently wrote on health topics for women's magazines and have been told repeatedly by the editors to stay away from the subject of tobacco." As another example, Deikman reports that in 1981, a senior vice president of MGM told newspaper executives that there had been too many negative film reviews and that they could not take for granted the $500 million in ads that the industry place with them. Sounding much like Procter & Gamble, he warned, "Today the daily newspaper does not always create a climate that is supportive and favorable to the motion picture industry. Gratuitous and hateful reviews threaten to cause the romance between newspapers and the motion picture industry to wither on the vine." More recently, the San Francisco Chronicle reported that the NBC television network cut off Saturday Night Live comedian Sam Kinison for about 30 seconds, long enough to eliminate one joke. "They've taken the pot. There is no more pot," Kinison said. "You can't get any more pot. If you give us back the pot, we'll forget about the crack." The show's producer, Lorne Michaels, later explained, they, the censors, didn't consider his drug references negative enough. The policy at NBC now is that the only references to drugs must be negative. Control of content is not exerted by advertising interest alone, but also by the owners of the media who hire and fire media personnel. Under normal circumstances, media personnel have considerable latitude in what they present, but according to Deikman's research, that latitude has its limits. What is not allowed is criticism of the free enterprise system itself. Writing in 1987, he commented, "Some reporters often criticize specific corporate acts, to the rage of corporate leaders. But the taboo against criticism of the system of contemporary enterprise is, in an unspoken way, almost as complete within the mainstream journalism and broadcasting programming in the United States as criticism of communism is explicitly forbidden in the Soviet Union." He predicts that the time came when corporations felt they were in fundamental jeopardy. Nothing would prevent them from exercising their power of ownership to protect their interests. Particularly in television, advertisers and the corporate world have been very influential in defining us to ourselves. The materialism and superficiality of most TV programs and the emphasis on a world of middle-class whites between 18 and 49 is not necessarily what the public wants, as TV executives claim, but what the advertisers demand. Such a covert indoctrination is typical of cults. In this instance, it is not a particular religion or philosophy being served, but rather the enhancement of desire, the selling of products, the protection of the status quo. The effects of this indoctrination are a measure of the power of the media and those who influence it, to shape our perception, to establish the climate of belief in which we live. Although they regard themselves as watchdogs in an adversarial role, media people are dependent on governmental authority because they rely heavily on access to the White House, Congress, and cabinet officials, and on maintaining special relationships with contacts at the Pentagon, the Food and Drug Administration, or whatever government agencies are relevant to their assignments. The authorities can reward favored journalists with inside information and news scoops, or penalize them by denying access. Bernard Rushko described a type of incident that occurs frequently enough to remind reporters that cooperation is essential to their livelihood. At a 1969 Nixon press conference, Stuart Lurie, then the Los Angeles Times White House correspondent, questioned the president. In response to the president's statement that he favored neither instant segregation nor instant integration, Lori asked whether the years 1954 through 1968 could be termed instant. The result was that Lori began losing his access to the news. He was dumped from the Air Force One press pool. On one Nixon trip to California, when the president invited several reporters to interview him while walking on the beach, Lori was left out even though he was the home paper and would have devoted much more space to the event. And Los Angeles Times reporters were not invited to administration's background briefings held to discuss the next year's State of the Union message. Consciously or unconsciously, every reporter must decide whether or not he or she wants to be another Stuart Lori. Without allowing themselves to notice, reporters may adjust their views or engage in internal censorship to minimize conflict with authority. Thus, their self-image of independence and objectivity can be preserved, and their access to the source, their suppression of dissent, becomes unconscious. All reporters assigned to a particular beat, for example, the Pentagon or State Department, are subject to these influences. They need access to their sources, who in turn have their own needs for media attention. This mutual obligation system is likely to co-opt the reporter who, over time, becomes part of the institution he is covering. Warren Weaver of the New York Times pointed to this problem in his book, Both Your Houses. Institutional reporting has its advantages. Members are more cooperative with reporters whom they come to sense as acolytes of the establishment. But the pitfalls are deep and dangerous. A reporter who has been admitted to an inner circle or even allowed to peep in occasionally from the edge is likely to be protective of the man who admitted him and of those observed there. A reporter may begin to identify with the source's point of view, to adopt a posture that is harmonious with the aims of the people he or she needs. News coverage is necessarily selective, and the selection process may work unconsciously to omit items that would spoil a reporter's relationship with the source and to focus on those which will enhance it. Mark Hertsgaard, a journalist who investigated the relationship between the press and the Reagan presidency, found a similar problem. Indeed, the political effect of most news coverage was to fill people's heads with officially sanctioned truth. This was to be expected. After all, the press took its definition of what constituted political news from the political governing class in Washington. Thus, while the press shaped mass opinion, it reflected elite opinion. Indeed, it effectively functioned as a mechanism by which the latter was transformed, albeit imperfectly, into the former. This unconscious process of accommodation and compliance is similar to in kind to that which Hugh and Clara Robinson experienced in Life Force. The dependence on Alex Monroe for advancement, favors, and continued status led them to support policies and behavior that they might otherwise have challenged. Their support for Alex was rationalized, using the group's dogma. Critical thoughts were pushed aside. On the one hand, media workers are interested in attacking the public interest by reporting dramatic conflicts in the social, economic, and political systems of which they are a part. On the other hand, they are also interested in sustaining the system which produces the revenues that pay their salaries. The owners of the media feel comfortable with the establishment of which they are privileged members and in which they believe. Media bias in favor of the status quo is often not obvious because of the appearance of debate in various mass media presentations, especially network television. However, debate turns out to be within the rather narrow limits acceptable to authority. A recent study was conducted of the guest list of ABC's Nightline. The analysis covered a 40-month period, 1st of January 1985 to the 30th of April 1988. Not counting ABC staff members, 5 guests appeared more than 10 times. Harry Kissinger, 14. Alexander Haig, 14. Elliot Abrams, 12. Jerry Falwell, 12. Alejandro Bendana of Nicaragua's Foreign Office, 11 times. According to the study, this distribution is characteristic. Conservative and right-wing spokespersons and government and ex-government officials dominated the airtime. Left-wing radical spokespersons were usually from foreign countries, counting only American guests who appeared more than 5 times. There were 19, all men. The woman who appeared most frequently was Jean Kirkpatrick. All guests were white except for Jesse Jackson and Harry Edwards. Of the 19 who appeared frequently, 13 were conservative, most connected in some way to the Reagan administration, labor, public interest, and social or ethnic leaders accounted for only 5.7% of the U.S. guest list. Such bias can be quite invisible to the editors and producers themselves. Their pride and belief in their independence reflects the fact that they are rarely subject to crude arm-twisting as to what or what not to present to the public. But their dependence on media owners and government elite for financial rewards, information, and position can exert an insidious form of control, as it does in cults. The whole process can take place automatically, smoothly, even for those with more time for considered decisions than the average gatekeeper. Fred Freed, a producer of outstanding NBC public affairs programs, reflected, "I have never been turned down for a program I wanted to do for censorship reasons. On the other hand, I'm not sure I have ever asked to do one I knew management would not approve for these reasons." The result of media self-censorship is a tendency towards perpetuation of the assumptions fundamental to the government and business interest on which the media depend. This can have particularly far-reaching consequences in foreign affairs. During the early years of the Vietnam War, most within the media did not question Cold War ideology, but continued to present the government's picture of a world divided into 2 camps, the free world and the communist. The latter assumed to be directed by Moscow through proxy armies in China, Cambodia, Vietnam, and elsewhere. This simplistic, ahistorical view supported the domino theory and justified intervention all over the world as vital to United States interests. Political scientist Daniel Hallen, who studied the role of the media during the Vietnam War, found that TV coverage did not often directly confront administration premises. Commentators and journalists disputed the effectiveness of government policies, but all in all, none of the larger questions posed by the war was raised in any substantial way in the news. There was no discussion of the origins of revolution. There was no second look at the doctrine of containment or its application to a conflict like Vietnam. Late in the war, when pressure for withdrawal began to mount, the media shifted to a more oppositional stance, but still within certain limits. Vietnam fits a pattern that has often been observed in situations of political crisis. The media in such periods typically distance themselves from incumbent officials and their policies, moving in the direction of an adversary, a conception of their role. But they do not make the system or its core beliefs an issue, and if these are questioned, usually rise to their defense. A similar situation prevailed in most coverage of the Iran hostage crisis during the the Carter administration. Sociologist David Altheide found that the Iranian situation was reduced to one story, the freeing of the hostages, rather than coverage of its background and context, of the complexities of Iran, of alternative American policies, and of contemporary parochial politics in a world dominated by superpowers. It's my mute button. Daniel Halen concluded that this is one of the most important consequences of the close connection between the modern media and the government. The range of political discussion in the press is usually restricted to the policy alternatives being debated in Washington. Economist Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, philosopher and linguist, did extensive research on media coverage of Latin America and Indochina. They found a consistent pattern of worthy and unworthy victims. As an example, they contrasted the news coverage of the murder of a Polish priest, Jerzy Popilowsko, killed by the Polish police in October 1984, with the coverage of the murders of a large number of Latin American religious in El Salvador and Guatemala. The victims of the communist governments received extensive coverage. They were apparently worthy. The victims of governments supported by the U.S. received scant treatment, qualitatively different as well as much reduced in scope. They were apparently unworthy. The worthy received dramatic treatment and demands for justice. The unworthy, mostly low-key, sparse descriptions accompanied by regrets about the violence from both right and left. The notion that the governments of Guatemala and El Salvador are reformist and centrist has been the official position of the Carter, Reagan, and Bush administrations, despite abundant evidence to the contrary. Herman and Chomsky made a compelling case for consistent media bias expressed with few exceptions through selective emphasis and by ignoring or downplaying contradictory testimony. The authors suggest that an additional factor may bias reporting on Latin America. Western reporters are rarely physically threatened, let alone murdered. In Poland, the Soviet Union, Cuba, or Nicaragua, they are often threatened and sometimes murdered. In El Salvador, Guatemala, and other U.S. clients in Latin America, this irony is not commented upon in the free press, nor are the effects of this potential and actual violence against dissident reporters on the possibilities of honest reporting. Thus, there is much evidence that the mainstream mass media, controlled by corporate and financial interests, dominated by advertisers, and dependent on government sources, generally reflects the point of view and interest of these groups. There are notable exceptions, such as the CBS documentaries, Hunger, and the Selling of the Pentagon, but covert conformity is the rule. In fact, these documentaries resulted in the network being investigated by the government agencies which they criticized. As media commentator Herbert Gans observes, it is rare to read or see in the mainstream media any discussion of why wealth is distributed so unequally in our country and between the developing and developed nations, or of the power of corporations over the average citizen. How shall we understand the media's support of the status quo? Is the mass media just a propaganda machine, as Herman and Chomsky suggest? These authors show bias that exists, but they write as if media complicity is conscious. In some cases, it may be, but I suggest that to a significant degree, the processes that lead to bias operate outside awareness, as in cults. The politically correct and the economically expedient are internalized, become unconscious, and are reinforced by the group, which includes the public. The assumptions that constitute the status quo are recycled for corporate owners, for advertisers, for government officials, as well as for the public. The limits defined by authorities are accepted unnoticed by almost everyone. Deikman concludes that the butcher's thumb that quietly tilts news in favor of corporate values has survived the rise in journalistic standards. The tilt has been so quietly and steadily integrated into the normal process of weighing news that the angle of the needle is now seen as zero. Within the corporate world, the more authoritarian the leadership structure, the less dissident is appreciated, and the more emphasis is given to loyalty to prevailing corporate views. Former General Motors executive John DeLorean describes how this loyalty was manifested. If your appearance, style, and personality were consistent with the corporate stereotype, you were well on your way to being a loyal employee. But loyalty demanded more. It often demanded personal fealty, actual subservience to the boss. Lower executives, eager to please the boss and rise up the corporate ladder, worked hard to learn what he wanted or how he thought on a particular subject. They then either fed the boss exactly what he wanted to know, or they modified their own proposals to suit his preferences. The devaluation and suppression of dissent can lead to financially disastrous corporate decisions or to violations of moral principles. The history of the Corvair is a case in point. As originally designed, the car had a tendency to flip over when making turns at high speed. According to John DeLorean, the problem was well known to GM engineers, a number of whom fought to modify the car's suspension or keep it out of production. They were overruled by the general manager and finally told to stop ejecting and get on the team. The Corvair was produced and sold, DeLorean commented. I don't think any one car before or since produced as gruesome a record on the highway as the Corvair. The costliest failure in the history of magazine publishing occurred when top executives of Time, Inc. pushed ahead with a project to publish a weekly broadcast and cable television listing magazine, TV Cable Week, without the market testing recommended by their own researchers and without first solving major problems which other subordinates had brought to management's attention. A former member of the editorial management team described how adverse facts were shunted aside and deleted from the final presentation to the board of directors. Sutton listened earnestly as Grum continued with his advice. Keep the presentation simple. Emphasize the upside. And above all, do not dwell on the complexities and uncertainties. The very risks that the task force had highlighted in the January presentation. Time Inc. proceeded to lose $45 million on a magazine that ran for only 6 months. Not only did the board members uncritically accept the optimistic presentation, so did a Wall Street brokerage firm. Monroe and his associates were preaching to an audience that was eager to believe. One of the analysts at the gathering, Ellen Gottesman, summed up his reaction to the presentation this way. Hell, if you hear the company's top men say they've got some new breakthrough computer system to publish the magazine, you're going to believe them, right? Wanting to believe is perhaps the most powerful dynamic initiating and sustaining cult-like behavior. Hugh and Clara Robinson accepted Alex Monroe's rationalizations for behavior that they would otherwise have labeled immoral, selfish, or cruel. Along with fear, the need to believe caused them to rationalize their own behavior and continue in life force long after the evidence of degeneration was in plain view to the outsider. A similar process seems responsible for the Corvair and the TV Cable Week fiascos. Dissenting voices that could have brought more reality to the decision-making process were ignored and suppressed. Wanting to believe affects everyone, leaders and followers alike. The avoidance of dissent is almost automatic where unequal power exists and the leader makes it clear that being contradicted is displeasing, even dangerous. Dissent can only be utilized if the leader and the group value it, understand its necessity, and demonstrate that dissent is welcome. In the corporate world, dissent is avoided and suppressed. The more a CEO is willing to occupy an eye-level world with his subordinates and insists on their gazing upward at him. The leader is not the only inhibiting force. The group as a whole can make its displeasure known if dissent focuses on areas of group vulnerability, such as immoral corporate behavior, over-optimism, leadership mistakes, and paranoia. Even if a corporate CEO welcomes dissent, lower-level executives may stifle contrary opinions so that it never reaches him or her. Something like this appears to have been responsible for the Challenger shuttle disaster, as described by Henry Cooper Jr. in The New Yorker. Vehicle engineers voiced their concerns about the safety of the O-ring seal and believed the launch should be canceled, particularly as the air temperature at launch site was lower than for any previous test measurements. Overruled by company officials, their objections were not passed on to those with final authority for the launch. Lower-level censorship is particularly likely when leadership wants condensed, simplified reports and summaries on which to base decisions. Unpleasant facts and possibilities are easier to prune and may be given shorter shrift than optimistic, forward-looking statements. Avoidance of dissent is often confused with loyalty. Authoritarian leaders tend to regard loyalty as the foremost virtue of subordinates. Peter Wyden describes how at the final meeting before the invasion of Cuba, Rusk, Nitze, and Bundy all set aside doubts and questions in order to close ranks with the president and vote in favor of the invasion. Only a lively appreciation of dissent's vital function at all levels of society can preserve it as a corrective to wishful thinking, self-inflation, and unperceived rigidity. In my view, the most prevalent current treatment of psychosis, in addition to reflecting devaluation of the outsider, demonstrates psychiatry's avoidance of dissenting views, its compliance with group pressures to maintain a particular belief system. The current swing to a biological view of emotional illness has been described by Walter Reich, former research psychiatrist at the National Institutes of Mental Health, as psychiatry's second coming. The first was the oversell of the psychodynamic psychoanalytic approach. The number of papers of a biological nature published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 1980 was almost double that of 10 years earlier. An even more noticeable shift has taken place in the archives of general psychiatry, which is now devoted almost exclusively to the biochemical and genetic research. Furthermore, government support for drug research is heavily weighed towards research in genetics, biomechanical causation of psychopathology, and drug therapy, while psychotherapeutic investigations receive relatively little funding. Part of psychiatry's current ideology is that a person diagnosed as a schizophrenic is doomed to lifelong social and work disability and recurrence of psychotic episodes unless treated with antipsychotic drugs, and is doomed to a lifelong social and work disability and recurrence of psychotic episodes unless treated with antipsychotic drugs. This belief persists despite studies that indicate otherwise. Lauren Mosher reviewed 4 long-term follow-up studies of patients treated before the use of neuroleptic drugs and found that they give us reason to be much more optimistic than we have been about outcome in schizophrenia. These 20-plus year follow-up studies yielded remarkably consistent results. 60 to 85% of schizophrenic patients, depending on the criteria used, had achieved good social recovery. How could there be such good outcomes without the use of drugs? These studies challenged pessimistic beliefs concerning the prognosis of schizophrenia and call into question the necessity and desirability of drug treatment. The most prominent belief of the current biological psychiatry movement is that drugs are the treatment of choice for psychosis. This belief ignores the study by Bachoven and Solomon comparing the 5-year follow-up data of two groups of hospital patients. The first receiving psychological treatment, 1947 to 1952, prior to the use of major tranquilizers, and the second group receiving drugs, 1967 to 1972. No difference in outcome was found. This finding suggests that the attitudes of personnel towards patients, the socio-environmental setting, and community helpfulness guided by citizen organizations may be more important in tipping the balance in favor of social recovery than are psychotropic drugs. These results were anticipated by Bachoven's study of the result of moral treatment, a humane, psychologically oriented hospital treatment program for the insane that flourished in the mid-19th century. Comparison of treatment results with the present-day statistics suggests that the moral treatment probably did as well or better than what is accomplished today with modern drug therapy. Keeping these findings in mind, it becomes apparent that psychiatry, as a whole, has avoided dealing with the facts and opinions that challenge its ideology. Writing in the Schizophrenia Bulletin, John Kane cautions, "Given the potential adverse effects that can be produced by antipsychotic drugs, it is critical that attention be given to the overall benefit to risk ratio when these agents are used. Although antipsychotic drugs may symptomatically improve a variety of conditions, they should not be used when equally effective and safer treatments are available." As the Bachoven and Solomon research indicates, equally effective and safer treatments appear to be available for many patients. This is also suggested by other findings, some of which I have mentioned, but these data, discordant with the dominant ideology, fall on deaf ears. When one considers the widespread reluctance of patients to take these drugs because of their distressing effects, the worsening of their condition that may take place. The disfigurement that may result and the equally good long-term outcome results of psychological treatment. The failure of psychiatry to take the dissenting data seriously is evidence of a cult-like ideology that shunts aside conflicting facts. As in overt cults, psychiatry's embrace of an ideology limits realism. When a hospital patient becomes more agitated, noisy, combative, or uncooperative, the standard staff response is to increase the dosage of neuroleptic drugs. Rarely is it considered that the patient's disturbance may reflect a conflict among the staff and that attention and corrective efforts should be directed there. Yet as early as 1956, Stanton and Schwartz had raised these issues in their landmark study of institutional participation in psychiatric illness and treatment. They analyzed and documented many strong effects of hospital dynamics on the behavior of patients. The most striking finding was that psychologically excited patients were quite regularly the subjects of secret, affectively important staff disagreement, and, equally regularly, their excitement terminated, usually abruptly, when the staff members were brought to discuss seriously their points of disagreement with each other. At the time, the authors were hopeful and optimistic that their research would change the way inpatients were treated. It has finally become clear that a mental hospital is a social system and that the meaning of any kind of action taken within it can be known only if the context is known. If it has become clear that many assumptions that had previously been taken for granted, such as the assumption that the mental hospital should take the general hospital as a model, are gratuitous and may be damaging. Built solidly into procedures, techniques, and even the language of the mental hospital is the assumption that patients are mere passive objects of treatment. They are to be cared for, protected, treated, respected, handled, controlled. Psychiatric administrative language consistently speaks of the patient as if he were not actively participant, as if he were an unconscious or half-conscious body upon an operating table. When it comes to schizophrenia, what Stanton and Schwartz learned seemed to have been forgotten. The awareness they hoped would change the mental hospital has not survived the Second Coming. Just as findings contradicting psychoanalytic assumptions were ignored by analytic theorists, so is work such as that of Stanton and Schwartz or Bachofen and Solomon largely ignored today. Psychiatry as a profession does not censor discordant information, but does ignore, dismiss, avoid it. Of course, in pointing out to those who apply only biological knowledge to the problem of psychosis and neglect the psychological, it should be recognized that there have been some psychiatrists who, drawing on R.D. Laing's ideas, have conceptualized acute schizophrenia psychosis as a voyage of discovery, a means of spiritual development to be supported and not interfered with. Drugs are seen as only harmful, and psychosis is romanticized. Maintaining such an ideology also requires one to ignore conflicting information, associating only with those who believe similarly and dismissing opponents as benighted. The word heretic is derived from the Greek heretikos, meaning able to choose. All too frequently, administrators of religions consider themselves to be God's representatives and define any choice of doctrine or interpretation but theirs as false or evil. To the extent that religious leaders claim divine authority, dissent is discouraged and suppressed among their followers. Although differences of interpretation of Holy Writ always arise, when these differences are substantial, they may not be tolerated. If dissenters are expelled or leave, a new religion may result. Many different sects have arisen in all the major religions. When an influential defies doctrinal authority, becomes a heretic, and the difference in interpretation is deemed dangerous to the faith of the true believers, punishment may be severe, barbaric. Muslim clergy tortured and killed Hala, the Sufi saint, for saying, "I am God." Clergy of the Inquisition tortured and burned Christians who were far less challenging, but were suspected of having the wrong beliefs. Some choices are not permitted, and dissent is punished, even in today's modern pluralistic Western world. A recent example is Pope John Paul II's attempt to banish dissent by revoking the right of a distinguished Catholic scholar, the Reverend Charles Curran, to teach at a Catholic university. Curran had dissented at some point from the non-infallible but traditional church teachings on sexual ethics. Archbishop Hickey explained the unusual and severe step taken by the Pope. The Holy See has gone on to clarify for us, to say there is no right to public dissent. A Vatican official commented further that we now have a situation in the United States where many theologians teach not only church doctrine, but also the dissent view. Then these professors ask the students to pick their choice, an absolutely unacceptable practice. Whether one's position on dissent in the theological domain is Whatever one's position on dissent in the theological domain, it is clear that such authoritarian attitude is incompatible with democratic government. Fundamentalist Jerry Falwell seems to agree but finds the problem to be democracy itself. Today we find that America is more of a democracy than a republic. Sometimes there is a mob rule. In some instances, a vocal minority prevails. Our founding fathers would not accept the tyranny of a democracy because they recognized that the only sovereign over men and nations was Almighty God. To read to, or even listen to differing opposing views, is to court disturbance, trouble, doubt. Billy Graham puts it thus: the world longs for authority, finality, and conclusiveness. It is wary of theological floundering and uncertainty. Belief exhilarates the human spirit. Doubt depresses. The exclusion of doubt has a price. Intellectual parochialism may not be fostered by restricting contact with outsiders and by building walls of indifference or, in the most extreme cases, hate. When religions provide schooling for members' children, such schools may isolate the children from other worldviews and facilitate a portrayal of the outsider as evil or inferior. When this educational institution is perpetuated into adulthood, when this educational insulation is perpetuated into adulthood, cult-like abuses may arise. Until recently, the Catholic parochial school system provided recruits for seminaries and convents, which in turn provide teachers to perpetuate the school system. Although not all parochial schools are repressive, many have created an atmosphere of fear, guilt, and conformity. As one former nun puts it, you are taught that what is bad in you is yours, what is good in you is God's. The deadening effect of such an education is attested to by ex-nuns' autobiographical accounts. I have been becoming more and more aware of the deadness I see all around me, the deadness of tired, tense bodies, clinging to a ritual, of people who patch up life's cracks so nothing new can sink in. I see their intensity and I see their seriousness. I see their compulsive concern for the slightest deviation from the holy rule. And what I find most frightening, I see the hugeness and monstrosity of their commitment to suffering. Christianity is not alone in providing systems which shield members from outside views. The Lubavitcher Hasidic community in Brooklyn is a case in point. Veneration of its leader approaches worship. The exclusiveness and separation of members from the larger community, enforced by unusual dress, elaborate rules and rituals, and specialized studies in language, can result in an extremely narrow and parochial outlook which is, in its essence, cult-like. In a long, mostly favorable article on the Hasidic communities, Liz Harris writes of being surprised when her host declared that he did not believe Jacobo Timmerman's description of his incarceration and torture by Argentina authorities. Indeed, he declared there was no anti-Semitism in Argentina. The reason for his view was that Timmerman was believed to be sympathetic to the communists. Since the communists were a godless people who persecuted Jews in Argentina at the time of the interview, he was certainly anti-communist. Timmerman was not to be believed. Harris comments, I found it astonishing that one obvious reality, the suffering of Russian Jews, could utterly annihilate another, the suffering of Jacobo Timmerman, and many like him. Did it matter to Moshe that Timmerman had emphatically denied any communist sympathies, or that fuzzy political accusations had brought about the disappearance of thousands of innocent people? The bright light that the Hasidim trained on their communal and inner life seemed to dim considerably when it was turned on the outside world, a circumstance that appeared to strain the quality of mercy hereabouts. Of course, the more a religion allows debate, discussion, and disagreement, the more adaptable and realistic it can be, the less captured by its form. However, this tolerance may threaten certainty, and certainty, as Billy Graham testified, is one of the great attractions of religious belief. Irving Janis, a psychologist who studied presidential advisory groups, notes that in Washington, as elsewhere, the suppression of deviant points of view is often done by subordinates to protect the president from discordant opinions that might damage their confidence. The underlying wish is to preserve for all the fantasy of the leader. Unless a leader clearly intends that subordinates should challenge and criticize, his or her views will meet little serious opposition. Hugh and Clara Robinson's story shows how cult followers, even without specific instructions, act to protect the position and views of the leader. In the capacity of protectors, group members maybe feel justified in employing threats, subterfuge, and deceit. In our government, as in most, a principal means of avoiding dissent and criticism is through the use of secrecy. Nowhere has this been more manifest than in the planning of covert operations such as the overthrow of Chilean President Salvador Allende during the Nixon administration, and the more recent disaster, the sale of arms to Iran during the Reagan administration. Secrecy supports cult-like behavior, as we saw in the Life Force group, where the hierarchy was maintained through limiting access to information. Secrecy functions not only to cover up unethical activities from outside eyes, but also to increase the authoritarian control over the larger group. By promoting the idea that the leader or the in-group have special information and expertise, they remove themselves from criticism and justify the exclusion of others from the decision-making process. In the case of religious cults, the special information and expertise is described as divine inspiration or enlightenment. The cult leader's presumed higher state precludes lower beings from judging his or her actions. Similar claims are made in government where special knowledge of the enemy or secret technical information is said to justify decisions that would otherwise be objected to on moral or even practical grounds. Secrecy is invoked often in the name of national security. Tom Wicker, New York Times columnist, commented on the connotations of that term, meaning we can understand in terms of cult psychology. But those two words, national security, are magic, an incantation vibrating with the ideas of power, knowledge, authority, responsibility, national security. The phrase rings with masculinity, patriotism, heroism. Used in tones of proper solemnity by someone from the White House or the Pentagon, those words can mesmerize most Americans, and a generation of Washington reporters stood mostly in awe of them. Not at least, I believe, because a reporter who knows something that can't be printed for national security reasons is elevated himself into that prized masculine circle of power, knowledge, authority, responsibility. He becomes the ultimate insider, and the reporter's deadliest enemy is desire to be accepted. Part of the world of power around him has won its final victory. As Americans, we affirm the right to dissent. Consider it of supreme value, make the infringement of dissent unlawful, and recognize it as... Try that again. As Americans, we affirm the right to dissent. Consider it of supreme value, make the infringement of dissent unlawful, and recognize it as basic to our political system. However, in actual practice, few of us are pleased when someone disagrees with us. At best, we tolerate it. Inwardly, we reject it. Although in our society the right to dissent is constantly affirmed, there is little indication that as individuals or in groups we value opposing views directed at ourselves. In science, within clear professional limits, there may be more appreciation of dissent, more readiness to welcome the opponent, but in general, although we may defend the right of an opponent to speak out against us, we are not grateful when he or she has done so. In almost all cases, we react to dissent as an enemy, countering with argument or a patronizing dismissal. This seems natural, just human nature. Yet considering how much of our thinking is prejudice, rigid, and self-protective, and how much we make use of inadequate and selective information, dissent deserves to be treated not as an adversary, but as an ally. Something that can rescue us from selective blindness, make us more realistic and thus more effective. Objectively, we should regard dissent with gratitude. It is a matter of some chagrin to me that even in the process of writing this book, I find it very difficult to practice what I preach. Whenever my own opinions are challenged, my first response is to put up my mental fists and fight back, defending my position. Only then do I catch myself and ask the dissenter, "Why do you think that?" Look around at all levels of society. The adversarial approach is ingrained. Authors, radio, television commenters, spokespersons for various causes, politicians of every hue, all insist on the rightness of their own views while denigrating the opposition's. Yet life is complex. Our perception and information are limited. Indeed, to some degree, everyone is in error. Just like the members of Life Force, we want agreement for our beliefs just so we can feel the security of being right. Dissent threatens that. It reduces our status, our certainty, our claim to privilege. As I remarked earlier, the problem with Reagan's evil empire speech was not so much that he was harshly critical of the Soviet government. Surely it deserved harsh criticism, but that he did not acknowledge that we as a nation are not free from evil, even if our system is more humane. In all the deservedly adverse comment that Reagan received for that speech, there was no recognition that similar speeches take place every day in the utterances and opinions of almost all citizens, liberal and conservative alike. Many people regarded Reagan and his conservative allies as the source of evil in this country, oblivious to the irony that in doing so they were engaging in similar thinking. Again, the key issue is not that criticism is undeserved, but that the persons dishing out criticism reserve none for themselves, nor do they acknowledge any validity to the other's position. They are not being artful. They simply cannot accept the fact that their adversary has the same self-righteous feeling as they do because the implications are uncomfortable. Our own feelings of insincerity and righteousness do not certify that we are right. To welcome dissent is to accept that fact. In ordinary life, dissent is restricted primarily to a selective focus on the familiar and the comfortable. At the same time, there may be more restriction by exclusion than we realize. In 1946, when I was in high school, a Russian communist was invited to address our weekly assembly. I remember that we were unconvinced by his protestations that the USSR wanted only peace. Afterwards, students joked, "Yeah, a piece of Poland, a piece of Hungary, and a piece of Germany." We were surprised to hear that the American Legion was upset that he had been allowed to speak to us. What were they afraid of? We thought. He hadn't captured our minds. Some years later, after the Korean War, I heard a talk by a former American soldier who had been a POW and had gone over to the Chinese communists. They had treated him well, given him a job, and even a daily glass of milk, which they understood to be necessary for Americans. But he found the conformity oppressive, became very homesick, and returned to the United States. He said he had been susceptible to their arguments because, coming from a small Midwestern town, he had never heard the United States criticized and was impressed that some of their criticism was undeniably true. Hearing this man, I realized that he rebutted the American Legion's concern. Not having been exposed to dissident views, he had been a sitting duck for skillful propaganda. Indeed, most of those who were similarly won over were from unsophisticated environments. I thought then how much we needed dissent. Yet I doubt that many American high schools during the last 3 decades have invited a communist to address their assembly. Since the McCarthy period, we seem less tolerant of challenges to our basic political principles. The Socialist Party is all but non-existent in America. Political statements are tame and court the national consensus. Free enterprise is not challenged. We pride ourselves on freedom of dissent, but there is not much serious dissent in our politics, nor in the national media. Radical voices tend to be dismissed as lunatic. It's a free country, but we are as free to turn our backs on dissent as to express it. In ordinary society, the cult processes of censorship and decreased contact with outsiders are often found. But in diminished intensity, the censorship of discordant information and isolation from heretical outsiders is usually done voluntarily rather than at the insistence of the group. Although the expression of deviant views is seldom encouraged, bankers tend to associate with bankers, doctors with doctors, sergeants with sergeants, black with black, and so on. Similarly, for various socioeconomic, ethnic, and religious groups, these associations provide not only shared interests, but also the security of support for one's views. Furthermore, liberals and conservatives tend to confine their reading to those magazines and columnists whose views are similar to their own. If they scan the writings of the opposition, it will be to attack and disparage, not to learn. At their political gatherings, one seldom hears a serious questioning of the group's beliefs or any acknowledgement that opponents may be correct in a particular instance. Instead, what takes place is an exercise in mutual support and validation, a reinforcing of the group's belief in the correctness of its views, a strengthening of the fantasy of being true, good, or superior. A de facto censorship operates continuously. Whatever the cause of these social ghettos, their effect is to deny a person the benefit of being challenged and contradicted.